today that Professor Samuel Redman of the University of Massachusetts will deliver this year's Mabel Loomis Todd Lecture. Professor Redman studies and teaches U.S. social, cultural, and intellectual history. It's just a wonderful nexus for a specialty. He received his BA in anthropology and history from the University of Minnesota at Morris, and an MA and PhD in American history at the University of California, Berkeley. Sam is the author of 3 books. His first book, Bone Rooms, From Scientific Racism to Human Prehistory in Museums, was published by Harvard University Press in 2016. His second book, Prophets and Ghosts, The Story of Salvage Anthropology, also published by Harvard in 2021, explores the history and legacy of salvage anthropology. A review in Science called that book, quote, a must-read for anyone seeking to confront racist worldviews and make the world a better place for all. His third book, which brought Sam to our attention, is The Museum, A Short History of Crisis and Resilience, published by New York University Press in 2022. The museum traces how cultural institutions responded to episodes of crisis over the past century in the United States. A review in The Guardian describes the book as, quote, a slender, taut work of scholarship that explores how museums have responded to crises both external and internal, beginning with a massive 1865 fire at the Smithsonian.
What?
I wrote this, or pulled this together in time for our annual meeting, which was, what, early February? And so much has changed in the past month that you'll have to come back next year and talk about contemporary resilience. But please welcome Sam Redman.
Hello. So happy to be here. So today, first of all, let me just acknowledge this incredible project that was recognized before the start of this talk, and how incredible and interesting it is to discover the rich textures of this community and to learn about different groups who are here that maybe I haven't known very much about in terms of their story in the Massachusetts area. So today I'll focus mostly on this third project, which admittedly was a pandemic project, and I'm going to try to make this interesting and compelling to folks. Even if you don't care about museums, I hope that you find something interesting and compelling in this talk and thinking about resilience for maybe other nonprofit organizations or corporations or educational facilities, really anything. So this, when we all went in lockdown, as I'll talk about for a few months, my brain got churning and I started writing this project that I'll be diving into today. And if one person in the audience buys this book today, then I'll be able to send my kid to UMass. But if everybody here buys it, I'll be able to send my kid to Amherst College. Okay, so what I'm going to really start off by mentioning is that this was part of a trajectory of work for me. My dissertation and first book project was thinking about collections of human remains, which are shockingly numerous in museums in the United States and in Europe. There are, according to one approximation, 500,000 sets of human remains, 500,000 individuals that are collected in repositories across the United States. Most of them are Native Americans, but there are many others. This photograph on the cover is of the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia, which are mostly Europeans, actually, who were collected and exhibited. So that was this shocking story. I became super interested and invested in thinking about the history of anthropology museums and anthropology collections. And where I'll really start and give a little bit more of a runway today is thinking about my second project, which was on the history of salvage anthropology. So just a quick definition, salvage anthropology was the belief that native people around the world and native people in North America especially were doomed to vanish. And the job of the anthropologist was to salvage or to quickly collect things as rapidly as possible to preserve these things for future generations. And as we'll see, this leaves behind a real mixed legacy, some really negative and that we can be quite critical of, but some aspects of it that are potentially positive or interesting for the use of today. And then as I was finishing the second book project, the pandemic came and that led to this third project. But just to be clear, a little bit about my work and where I'm coming from and who I am as a person at this moment. I've of course been spending a lot of time in museums. I come from a museum background where my first internships were things like moving a kayak or a totem pole. I mean, you name it. I was there to help you move it. It was not terribly intellectually sophisticated at first. I was sort of moving my way up and thinking about museums, but initially it was very object-oriented. And over time I became increasingly compelled by, interested in, invested in this idea of where these objects came from. So now, as you can see, a lot of my time is spent in dusty archives, like at the American Museum of Natural History, reading letters from folks in the 19th century talking about where and how they acquired these objects, what they were thinking about when they put these objects on display. And what sort of ethical considerations there were, but also their drives, their motivation, the competition that they were engaging in, you name it. So in a very gossipy, fun sort of way, being a historian of the 19th century means that you're reading dead people's mail. I mean, how fun and wonderful. And you get these amazing little inklings or indications of what life was like, right? That someone's writing to you from this hotel that advertises itself as absolutely fireproof, right? And that's in some ways a little bit foreshadowing of where we're going, because it seems like everything burned down in the 19th century. So again, with this sort of in mind, with this added context, I want to show a behind the scenes glimpse of the Smithsonian Institution in the 1880s. So we often talk about the late 19th century as, or historians talk about the late 19th century as the great age of organization. Okay? So to me, this kind of looks like my bedroom as a teenager, more so than the great age of organization, if we're thinking about sort of the process of colonialism. But what you can get an indication of, I hope, from looking at this image, which is now still on the mall. This is still on the National Mall. You know, to me, this indicates, rather than organization, the sort of mass of materials that was coming into the Smithsonian Institution and other major museums at this time that was coming in, according to, again, some of these letters, by the train carload in boxes as large as the desks at the Smithsonian. So sometimes, in fact, many tons of material would be arriving from places like the American Southwest or Latin America or Africa, being shipped there over time, over the course of many years, building up, in some cases, the largest collections of their kind in not only North America, but around the world. And again, just to indicate that this is not somehow this like niche thing necessarily in the way sometimes we think about the history of museums today. These were incredibly popular places at the turn of the century. So here is early in the 20th century, the Field Museum opening a new building where it is now. If you're a football fan at all, this is right next to Soldier Field where the Chicago Bears play, facing up now towards downtown Chicago. But you know, what's amazing about this area now is it's all built up, and now here in this photograph, they're really just building this up as an institution. But it would have been, and this is why I argue that this is important, this would have been a gateway for a huge number of Americans and Europeans to learn about the world. right? To learn about different ideas in natural history, in what we now call or think of as the social sciences. This would have been an incredible sort of meeting point of different cultures and ideas and different elements of social life and education. So for me, in thinking about museums and what they represent to a community, we can actually think about a lot of just different things, different ideas. We can ask a lot of different questions as historians. And we can also observe the remarkable ways in which people are dressed in this photograph, right? Wearing their Sunday finest to go to the opening of the museum. And indeed, this tradition continued on. Something that many folks probably in their own lifetime sort of recognize or think of the way in which museums have been this educational tool. But we also probably could look at this photograph and think some more critical thoughts, right? About the white European or Euro-American gaze that is taking place and looking at Native Americans in this sort of staid, under glass perspective. And that's something I was thinking about a great deal when writing and thinking about the history of salvage anthropology. So in May 2019, right before the pandemic, I completed an oral history interview with an incredible artist named Marie Watt. And Marie Watt is a Seneca individual and this incredible artist who largely works with fabrics, and she does community-oriented weaving and quilt making, and thinks really deeply about the nature of these objects from an indigenous perspective. And she shared with me in her interview her perspective that it's problematic that most people's understanding of American indigenous culture is often limited to objects in museums and anthropology collections, darkly lit under glass rather than direct experience, interaction, and engagement with indigenous people and our communities. So these are some of the thoughts that I had going into the era of the pandemic. And then of course, right after this interview was completed, life really changed a great deal, right? And according to UNESCO, 90% of museums closed at least temporarily during the COVID-19 pandemic. So that got me thinking a lot about life in this era. A book editor had asked me to write a book about what museums should be, and I sort of went away from that meeting thinking, I don't know that anybody really cares what I think museums should be. But this crisis moment that then suddenly we were faced with made me think about the topic of museums and crisis. And so that's what led me to this book, The Museum, that we'll be meditating on today. And I'm gonna make this very easy for all of you as students. I just gave my midterm to my students at UMass, and they all survived, so I think all of you will survive today too. But I'm going to front load both the questions and, frankly, some of the answers here too. So this won't be too hard of an exam here at the end. But I'm asking in this book and in this talk, what can episodes of crisis teach us about museum history? And then also, what lessons should be drawn from this history for museums today? And that really could be for cultural institutions or organizations today. And in thinking about this story, to me, it actually starts with this really remarkable episode. So I hadn't heard of the 1865 Smithsonian fire. I wonder if anybody here comes into this having heard of this. Okay, one person, okay, maybe you haven't heard of this because there was something else going on at this particular moment. The American Civil War was a little distracting to most folks, but this was front page of the New York Times story in January 1865 when it happened. This massive fire sweeps through the Smithsonian Castle and utterly destroys most of the objects inside, most of the artifacts and historical materials. And worried soldiers and citizens are looking on as this horrible event happens that the New York Times describes as almost unparalleled in terms of a cultural crisis in the United States. It's this utterly devastating thing. But then something pretty remarkable happens. Here's a photo of the Smithsonian only about 20 years later, in the 1880s. And what happens is that the Smithsonian almost uses the fire as an opportunity to regenerate itself as an institution. It starts to organize its collections in a more coherent fashion. It hires more curators and more experts. It cleans out the hallways and electrifies the galleries. So, you could actually see the things that were on display for the first time. And it seems like the Smithsonian, after this horrible, devastating fire, has only improved its standing. Its attendance and membership numbers are way up. Its sort of cultural standing as a scientific institution are not diminished by this fire, but instead expanded. So the sort of core question of this book became this notion that with the 19th century Smithsonian fire and the subsequent recovery in mind, I wanted to look at that and sort of see if there were some trends in the 20th century looking forward that we can think about in terms of museum crisis. And in fact, and this is where I give away the punchline here at the very beginning of the talk, here were the things that I came up with as conclusions. I want to argue that museums are not invincible. Well, I could look through these these stories and find some counterexamples of museums that have closed or completely been destroyed or diminished by crisis moments. But on the whole, what stands out here is that museums are remarkably durable as institutions, as cultural institutions. They can also become more resilient or more durable by critically learning from their own histories. That, especially with the 1918 Spanish flu, as I'll talk about here, a lot of this museum history was forgotten or overshadowed by other things that were happening. So by looking at these histories more critically and more holistically, we could perhaps better prepare for the next crisis moment around the corner. I want to argue that the most important safety feature for any museum is not a new security system, it's not laser beams that are keeping some criminal conspiracy out from your galleries, but it's your staff and volunteers, simply put, are again and again the most crucial safety feature for museums. And then lastly, perhaps most importantly, and where I will begin my comments on chapter 1, is that crisis moments are often experienced on multiple fronts. And this was the thing that really first stood out to me when in my office, snowed in the pandemic, there's no place to go, I started thinking about the 1918 flu, as you do, right? And the first thing that stood out to me when reading annual reports from museums from this era is how little the flu is talked about or described, right? Historians have sometimes talked about the 1918 or Spanish influenza as the forgotten pandemic. And this, arguably, this experience of studying this really lent credence to that as an idea. Because while the flu is having a very real impact on museums, as I'll touch on, probably 90% of the ink that they're spilling and thinking about this was not about the Spanish flu at all, but instead about the First World War, about the crisis of World War I, about all of the curators and museum staff that are being drafted or volunteering. Suddenly, the US military needs experts in textiles, for parachutes and building biplanes and things that we don't necessarily think of as war making are suddenly being called up as being really important. So the entire textile division of the Philadelphia Museum of Art is called into service, for instance. However, there are many others that are dying of this mysterious disease that people are still learning and figuring out what it may entail. And what's so shocking, as you may know, about the Spanish flu is that it's stricken predominantly young people and healthy people, as opposed to many other strains of the influenza virus. So this has a major impact on museums. As you can see here, this is the Oakland Gallery of Art, now part of the Oakland Museum of Art. And you can sort of get an indication that this is an art museum because of these faux columns that are back here, but it's been turned into this infirmary, right, for the duration of the influenza epidemic. So there's a real obvious example. And honestly, coming into this project, there was so little that was written about how museums were impacted by the Spanish flu. This is one of the only photographs I could really find connecting the two. But it turns out that there are, in fact, a number of really important connections. So turning from California back to New York, one of the main things that comes out of this as being really notable was the fact that museums like the American Museum of Natural History used the Spanish flu as an opportunity to pivot. And instead of only teaching about meteorites and dinosaurs and things from a long time ago, the past in natural history, a turn becomes that these museums, like the AM&H, start doing more with current events or responding to sort of the present moment. And a new wing of the museum or a new section of the museum focuses specifically on public health. And famously, they advertise a new exhibit on infectious disease with signs that read, "Don't spit." And people are attracted to this as a new sort of blockbuster exhibition, and you can see lines going around the block. I love the idea that we have an infectious disease. Let's get everybody tightly packed in the same sort of room, in the same sort of space. But nevertheless, you can see this as this really important sort of public health move, right? To gain traction and to get people into the museum. Another interesting thing happened while writing this chapter. I was sort of starting to then read against the grain, which is what historians often call, we're sort of not taking people 100% at their word. We're understanding that there might be sort of subtleties beneath the surface, or people might be engaging in excuse making from time to time. Well, one thing that sort of happened in the writing of this first chapter is that museum directors were complaining over and over again in Chicago, Philadelphia, and Boston, and New York City about the terrible, awful, no good weather of 1918. I was like, okay, sure, but also there's a flu epidemic that's killing hordes of people, right? Well, then I went back and I looked at the historical weather data from this era, and it turns out, weekend after weekend, people were slammed with these horrible blizzards from this era. So when we think about attendance figures, right, and sort of a barometer of health of an institution, we might see, in fact, worries about the First World War, worries about the Spanish flu, and this really devastating weather, as well as this is also Red Summer. There's a whole bunch of violent lynching of African Americans happening in the North and South at this exact moment. So there's a lot happening here in terms of crisis moments, and it was a good reminder that crisis moments are rarely ever singular. So now I'm sort of looking ahead through some of the chapters of this book, and I'm going to try to entertain you and make you think with some compelling stories. If you would have thought about a museum crisis in the early 1920s, the answer that most people would have given you was overcrowding of storage and these facilities. I mean, if you are a museum professional in the audience and you look at this, you're going to cringe, because you can see right there, waiting for one kick of a high heel shoe or a boot, are these objects that are literally on the floor. And thinking about how best to organize this going into the 1920s and on the horizon, the 1930s, people believed this was going to be the crisis. Well, of course, not fully anticipated in this was the economic catastrophe of 1929 and beyond, and the outset of the Great Depression. So again, this becomes both at once a crisis and an opportunity, because the federal government begins to inject a huge amount of money, funds, to hire new workers through such New Deal organizations as the Works Progress Administration, also the National Youth Administration, that was hiring workers who were more on the ages of 14 to 16, who would be hired temporarily by museums to do things like recatalog collections, or to create a new card catalog that was not just arranged by object type, but maybe arranged by location where material had been found. So we take for granted, right, that we can look up things that are from Cambodia in our collection, or we could look at things that are knives, and maybe we could see knives from Europe as well as knives from Cambodia and compare and contrast them, or fishing, objects used in fishing. We can look at them across cultures. That was not nearly as easy as it is today in the 1930s with the existence of basic card catalogs. But if you can hire an influx of workers to help you with these problems, you can make museum collections much more usable and feasible. And indeed, the Smithsonian benefits from more than 6 figures of hundreds of thousands of what are then called man-hours of the labor of men and women who are injected into these public institutions, small and large, on the West Coast and East Coast. So here we have this, again, we're starting to see a little bit of a pattern here. There are these very real and genuine crisis moments, but then something that comes out of them that is potentially productive. So if you think about World War II and museums in Europe, it is, of course, a bad scene, right? And at museums in London and elsewhere across Europe, they're looted. They are facing bombardment. Museums in London in particular, where this photograph was taken, remove from their walls all paintings, all objects, except for the largest and heaviest to move statues remain in place. And this is a protective measure. And by contrast, American museums largely stay open. They maybe take some protective measures, but they are in fact benefiting in some ways from people moving around during the Second World War. And there are many different examples of this, but one is this little notation here that you can see that this is a free postcard for service, right? So uniformed servicemen in Washington, D.C., many of whom are stationed there as code breakers and language experts, people working at the Pentagon and other war agencies during the war, are encouraged to come to the Smithsonian and send postcards back to Iowa and Kansas and California. There are also radio programs that are innovated during this era, and at least 700 instances that I was able to document of the US Army and Navy turning to the Smithsonian for information about steaks or rare birds or language information or German radio equipment or whatever else. So World War II again becomes this crisis and opportunity moment. Something though that maybe is a bit more familiar to us today is the way in which museums became a site of protest by the late 60s and early 70s. Does anybody have memory of this event of the art strike of 1969? Okay, so in some ways this is sort of an obscure moment or event, but in another way, newspapers in New York City covered this a lot. People were very interested in this as a moment. And of course, 1969, 1970, both of those summers feature a huge amount of protest. And what we often forget is that it's not just Vietnam War protests. There are also conservative counter-protesters in Central Park, and there's a lot of foment and tension happening at this moment. But a group of protesters, organized initially by artists, decide to try to shut down all of the museums in the city of New York for a day. And they want to protest specifically the war in Southeast Asia, but they also want to protest a lot about what's going on in these institutions, especially at the Met, where this photograph was taken. So you can see that the protesters are holding signs that say art strike against racism, war, and repression. Sort of interestingly, sexism was added later as a consideration for the protesters, according to one person, as though an afterthought. But this becomes this meaningful moment of protest for a number of protesters who want to protest at galleries as well as public museums. And indeed, the Guggenheim, the American Jewish Museum, and several other museums shut down for a day, sort of in response to this, in solidarity. But the Met Museum, photographed there earlier, only the main entrance is shut down for a time. And what's compelling to me about this as a story is sort of the failures of the administrators here, frankly, that a lot of the response to this is quite dismissive, quite ham-handed, and it ultimately damages the Met as an institution, and one that maybe has this national prestige, but one that is looked at in a different way, especially by artists, but also people more generally in New York following this set of protests. Here's a remarkable photograph of the director of the Met coming out and taking it on the chin a little bit here, being grilled by protesters. But you could see that people were compelled by this and fascinated with what this was and where it was going in this moment of 1969, 1970, where there is in fact a lot of remarkable protests. So I sort of meditated in this chapter on who the artists were, how they sort of centered themselves in this debate in a way that might be a little unfamiliar to us today, but also that this was a sort of partial success on the part of the protesters, but from the museum side, there leaves a lot to be desired. Okay, this is perhaps, if you are taking a class on public history as a bachelor's or a master's student, perhaps the most famous example that you'll learn about is the story of the Enola Gay. So, one of the most famous war machines, of course, of the 20th century is the B-29 superfortress, the Enola Gay, that drops the first atomic weapon in warfare in 1945. And questions loom about what to do with the airplane ever since that time. For a time it goes to the US Air Force Museum before ultimately going to the Smithsonian Institution, where a draft script of what the exhibit would look like is leaked and ends up in the hands of veterans groups, veterans organizations that ultimately charge that the Smithsonian is doing too much to look at this in terms of the perspective of possible war crimes, and not enough in terms of the perspective of the veterans. And this debate becomes incredibly heated for about 6 months in the 1990s, reported on newspapers from the LA Times to the Washington Post, and ultimately what ends up happening is that the whole exhibit is essentially thrown out. And it's placed, the Enola Gay that is placed on display at a branch of the Air and Space Museum with almost no interpretation whatsoever. I mean, now it will tell you how many guns are on the airplane, what horsepower the engines are, how many people were assigned to work on it, but it won't tell you much about the most important thing about this airplane, right? Is its role in the arrival of atomic warfare on the planet Earth, right? I mean, that's a pretty important story for an object to tell. But many people see this as this crisis moment that maybe less positive things came out of it, right? And that it became this sort of talisman for public historians to think about how this had been a failure. It's also an indication, as were the earlier art protest movements, a failure in a lack of collaboration, right? Is that in the early phases of exhibit planning, there wasn't enough sort of open-minded listening of different perspectives and different ideas of how this might be interpreted and displayed. And we can also think about the role of the expert, the role of the curator, people who lived through this as a first-hand experience, what their expertise might be. There are lots of things to say about the Enola Gay. But of course, crisis moments and museums have continued apace. I'm going to show only one photograph here just because it's so dramatic of a museum outside of the United States. Here in the top right is the Brazilian National Museum, which was burned and destroyed in a fire just a few years ago. The Getty Museum here on the upper left, and this isn't even the most recent fire that has threatened the Getty Museum in Los Angeles. Of course, water and fire are both bad for museums, suffice it to say. Here, water damage at the 9/11 Museum just prior to its opening, I think with Hurricane Sandy. And the Museum of Chinese in America also suffered from a fire. But what I want to point out is that when we think of museum fire, we think of objects being burned, right? But as is true with the Museum of Chinese in America there on the lower left, the damage actually came from the recovery efforts, right? From well-meaning and well-intended efforts to put out the fire leads to really extensive water damage that then curators and conservators and other folks are wrestling with and dealing with from there going beyond. This continues again up to the present day with conversations about whether or not to reinterpret or remove exhibits, problematic, outdated exhibits, as well as statues. So yeah, I'm going to show a couple photographs of this, but this is this very famous statue that I'm sure many of you grew up walking by, going by the American Museum of Natural History in New York, that shows Teddy Roosevelt depicted on a horse with lower or maybe in a more subservient position, a Native American and an African American man. And this became the site of protest for both liberal and conservative counter-protests in the wake of the pandemic, as many other statues are being torn down. So here we can see the statue covered in paint as a protest, and then a couple of weeks later, Fox News sponsored a conservative counter-protest in an effort to save the statue. So ultimately, what the American Museum of Natural History decides to do is pack the statue up and send it to the Teddy Roosevelt National Park off in the Dakotas, where, I don't know, I guess somehow out there it's somewhat less racist, but I don't quite know about that as a solution, but whereas they'll try to interpret it with more contextual signage and conversation. So this is to say, as I transition to this final part of the conversation, that museums have become the site of protest and cultural conversation for a variety of reasons, not only what they have displayed at these places, but how well they're treating their workers, their staff, their employees, right? So here we can see at the MoMA a protest sign that says, last year Matisse cutouts, this year MoMA healthcare cuts, right? So thinking about what these places mean and represent, not just in terms of their public exhibits, but how they treat their staff and their workers. But I want to end, I hope, with a couple of inspiring stories about the legacy of these collections and places. The one story that caught my attention was this incredible artist named Wendy Redstar, who found in the same archives that I was working in at the Smithsonian photographs of her ancestors. An 1880 delegation from Montana to Washington, D.C. And during our interview, my interview with Wendy, I started to sort of ask, I think, some sort of conventional academic questions. Like, don't you see sort of the othering of the gays here? Don't you see how these people are being taken advantage of? And Wendy pushed back on that formulation. And she said to me, you know, I really do feel like we need to give our ancestors more agency. I think they knew what they were doing, and maybe sometimes they were doing things for subversive reasons to maintain the culture. I realized too that this is part of our story, this colonialism and this way of collecting objects. And that's part of the object story now too. You can't deny that, and you shouldn't. So what Wendy does with her art, she's a multimedia artist, she makes lots of really incredible art, you should check it all out. But one of the things she does is she takes these historical photographs, enlarges them, and then annotates them really assertively with a red pen, and says, you know, this is not just some warrior, right? This person's name was, and the reason why they're holding this feather is because, and here's each of these objects' meaning and what they account to. So this keeps me thinking about the utility of museums and thinking of another conversation I had with a curator named Joe Horscapture, who reminded me that there are many examples of Native researchers combing this information and bringing it back to the community. This includes details about ceremonies that are no longer practiced and language resources. So he said to me, if these didn't exist in museums and archives, how would they be brought back to the community? So it's a love-hate relationship. And finally, one last story that I have to tell is a story involving some new technology and the legacy of these collections. So part of the problem with the idea of permanent preservation in the 19th century is that they really meant permanent. So a lot of objects that were collected in the 19th century were quote unquote treated with arsenic and mercury. And the reason why was to try to prevent this organic material from being eaten by pests, from being eaten by mice and rodents and insects and other things that might get at these materials. The problem is, in our era of repatriation and return and hoping to see these things reused in ceremonies, we can't in good conscience give someone a hat that was dipped in arsenic and then expect them to reuse this in a ceremony. So this was the problem. And the Tlingit community and the Smithsonian came to a really interesting solution, where an old hat from the 19th century, here pictured on the left, was 3D scanned. And some adjustments were made. It wasn't a one-to-one replica, but this was used as basically the inspiration for a new hat. And this is where it gets really cool and exciting to me, is that the Tlingit community decided to put both hats into a room overnight. And it asked the younger hat to listen to the stories of the older hat, and the older hat to tell its experiences to the younger hat. So Ray Wilson, here pictured on the right, says, our grandchildren will be using this hat down the line, but we did ask the old hat if they would treat the new hat like it was his child. So I like this idea that we can think anew about museums and collections and these problems and wrestle with the legacy. But we're still at an uncertain time. Museum attendance is down still slightly since the COVID-19 pandemic, and there's still great uncertainty about how to acknowledge these past traumas in collecting and display in public institutions. How can we be more receptive to the concerns of protesters and challenge and learn to grow and change these cultural institutions over time? So I think that's a challenge that all of us here will continue to wrestle with. And I'm so grateful that folks here have taken the chance, or taken the time to listen to me meditate on these as questions. And I welcome any of your questions or thoughts or feedback.
I grew up in the Smithsonian because my dad was born in Georgetown, and his idea of a wonderful summer vacation, free air conditioning, was to take all 6 of us to the castle,
Yeah.
the museum. I became a history major, and his sisters became psychology majors, so something to do with that.
Yeah.
But Smithson himself was English, as I recall, so please correct me if I'm wrong on this. And then Udvar Hazig, where the Enola Gay is displayed today, and that's my main comment, was Swedish. Neither of them American, I believe.
Yeah.
And it's just, that always struck me as fascinating that non-Americans helped us preserve our history.
Without a doubt. Yeah.
I don't know that could happen today, or maybe it will. But as I recall, the word I'm thinking about is courage, because in History Wars, I have to go back and reread it. I believe the director of the Smithsonian was forced to resign around this Enola Gay exhibit simply because he wanted to display not a wall of massive amounts of photos, but include ground damage, human damage caused by at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And he eventually was fired for wanting to do this. Please correct me if I'm wrong,
Yeah.
this is what I remember.
Yeah.
And I just wonder if that courage, given recent Columbia, CEOs, administrators with a CEO profit mentality, I wonder if that courage exists today among our museum administrators, because they risk career if
Yeah.
they speak up. If they speak up, in my opinion, for good, they risk their own career. So I don't know. That's
Yeah.
just a hodgepodge of thoughts.
Yeah, no, but what a great comment, though. I appreciate that. And it definitely reminds me of, with the Enola Gay story, one of the things that comes out of this, or just history in general, maybe this isn't too revelatory of a statement, is how rarely there are just like very clear lessons, like cut and dry lessons, especially in the immediate aftermath of a thing. What was interesting was to go back and read some of these articles in the newspaper from the 1990s about the Enola Gay and people's perspectives sort of in that moment, where they feel, many of the participants feel like they failed, they hadn't gotten their way. But in a sort of longue durée, I think, as your comment suggests, like the thing that stands out there is, wow, some of these people were pretty bold and brave and courageous, as you say, and they stood up for what they believed. But it wasn't, the thing that sort of stood out to me in retrospect again, is like, it wasn't immediately clear how that courage had played out in the moment necessarily. But sort of in a retrospective view, a couple of years later, or 5, 10 years later, we might look at that a bit differently. And I think that's, maybe that's one of the lessons from this project, is that there's sort of almost a historical autopsy, if you will, of something that occurs right away, where it's like, okay, what do we all think that happened, and maybe we debate it in the news media. Then 10, 15, or 20, or 30 years later, those events could look a great deal different. I think I'm more critical, for example, of the artists in the 1960s, 1970s example than if I had sort of lived through that moment where, they're fighting the good fight in their view. And I think they are. But there was another part of me where I'm like, guys, you're kind of making this all about you here. Like, it's really, we've lost sight of the protests of the war in Asia, and we're thinking about your own ego at certain moments. So yeah, I value all of those comments, and I think that one of the things that it makes me think is that sometimes a little bit more of that historical distance can give us different perspectives on how that courage played out in the moment.
Yeah. This is probably an unfair question, but do you think the Smithsonian has enough independence to prevent the felon-in-chief from closing museums or selling off collections?
It's a great, reasonable question, I think. In fact, I don't think it's unfair at all. I think that,
asked you.
well, okay. Here I will, also, historians are notoriously bad at predicting the future, so, but, all right. That said, several of my close friends, through writing these projects, as you might imagine, work at the Smithsonian, and we engage in all sorts of conversations on our text threads that, sometimes are more official, and then sometimes it's a little off the record sort of a thing. And I guess what sort of gives me some solace, if anything, is that whereas there were so many different targets of the Trump administration version 1.0, what's sort of surprising is both in the Reagan years and in the Trump years, the Smithsonian is more or less unscathed in terms of its funding amounts and in terms of its sort of approach. Now, the National Park Service takes a lot more hits, no doubt, both in the Reagan era and in the present context. That said, I don't want to be naive about any of this, and I think that the Smithsonian is a target for potential attacks and sort of this crisis in this way. So I don't have an exact answer for that, but yeah, that's a totally fair, reasonable concern.
Well, they have withdrawn funding for the national support for museums and libraries.
The IMLS, yeah, and so that's one way where between that, the NEH, the NSF, a lot of that funding will no doubt harm major museums, the Smithsonian included, but also the American Museum of Natural History and other big places like that. It's also, I mean, if you just go to any of these places, like on a Saturday, just go walk around and see the people who are in there. I mean, we can think of these places, I think reasonably so, as elitist and top-down in their orientation. But when I go to these places, I'm also struck by how many people are there from around the world. I went to the Whitney Museum this weekend, and there are a lot of young people there and people that are coming from all over the world to come check these places out. And you know, I don't know if that ultimately will help buttress them against these challenges, but no doubt the IMLS and the NEH and NSF attacks are going to arguably be the next crisis moment. That if I could add another chapter of this book, that might be it. Yeah.
I had in your presentation 2 times when I had thought about this. When the LA fires were happening,
Yeah.
I remember thinking how many museums and galleries were losing things.
Yeah.
But then when you had the picture of, I think it might have been in London or something, when all the galleries were stripped for
Yeah.
safekeeping. Mike piggybacks on her question. Are there talks now about safeguarding potential art that could be stripped out of our museums and galleries, because that's a real concern as well?
Yeah, great question, especially because, I mean, sort of, if you've been reading the news of the stupid recently, right, where people will do that, with the Enola Gay, for example, some the digital federal pages were stripped from existence because it had the word gay in it. Not mentioning that was the name of the mother of the pilot, who, you know, that has nothing to do with sex and sexuality, right? So a question I think becomes like, you know, what is sort of the top level targets of this 21st century culture war? And then, you know, the scary part is like, okay, what's below that, right? And as you mentioned, it can include things like controversial art, and other materials. So no doubt, I think museums need to be cautious entering this moment. And it's sort of, it's quite a contrast from the World War II era, where museums were so eager to step into the war effort, even more so than the First World War, where it's like they really wanted to support the federal government. And now we're seeing here this real contrast of this moment. Yeah. Here.
I guess I grew up in New York City, and I was only 2 years old when the artists kind of strike happened, so I had no idea about that.
Sure. You were finger painting when, that's so cool though.
But like, would King Tut have been like the reverse of that crisis? And
Yeah.
when museums all of a sudden find themselves in these like boom times,
Yeah.
do they forget the crises, or do they kind of take their sort of whatever benefits they get and then sort through the problems?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I don't know that I have a totally exact answer to that, but I will say that in the artist strike moment, the Met is also coming out of a controversy about an exhibit called Harlem on My Mind. And the exhibit was about Harlem. However, it included no input of people from Harlem. So it was a photographer, a white photographer from a sociological perspective, who took photographs of Harlem, and then a white author who wrote the compendium piece to go along with it. So then a couple of months later, security guards go through the galleries at the Met, and they see that tiny H's have been scratched into several of the most famous, prominent paintings in the Met. And people still to this day don't know if it was connected to H for Harlem, or if it was just someone, you know, wanting to vandalize and using that as an excuse, or what. But I think in the midst of all of this context and sort of the soup of the Vietnam War protests, the Harlem on My Mind exhibition, part of the reason why the artists' strike attracts so much attention is, to your King Tut point, museums have grown in their cultural relevance in that moment, right? That lots of people are paying attention. Major blockbuster exhibits are attracting more audiences than ever, but also more sort of cultural critique. Like, people are writing about them more, they're thinking about them more. And so, yeah, they're attracting a lot more attention, and I think that's partly like what makes them still to this day a site of protest. Like, one of the things that I'm asked about in the context of this book is like, well, what about people throwing tomato soup at Van Gogh paintings to protest climate change? And you know, I feel like many of you probably pretty conflicted about that, right? Where it's like, I want people to be able to protest and use their voice and make a big statement. I also want my kid to be able to see these paintings. And I think both of those things can reasonably coexist as feelings. So yeah, I think the overall growth and cultural prominence of museums in that era make them a more intense site of foment. So in a sort of curious way, yeah, I think the artist strike and the King Tut display are connected. I hadn't thought of it in that way though, so I appreciate you pointing that out. Yeah, in the back.
It's not a question, it's just a comment.
Please.
When you showed the picture of the Smithsonian fire in
Yeah.
1865, it made me think of the Notre Dame fire.
Oh, yeah.
Because the change that has ensued since that fire, it's kind of like a blessing in a way. I mean, all these old paintings and artworks and stuff have been cleaned and made visible.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it also sort of forces us to confront, rather than, I mean, in some ways we think of museums as this sort of almost encased in amber, and even cathedrals, right? Like, this is going to be this way forever, right? But really, those wooden beams need to be replaced, and the stained glass windows need to be cleaned, right? There's sort of a living element of it that we can often lose sight of. And, you know, comparably with the Smithsonian fire, it's that this is this devastating fire, but it allows an opportunity for sort of regeneration, if you will, and sort of rethinking the priorities of the museum in the long term. Yeah.
I'm thinking about the stories that museums tell, but they're not always of the viewpoints we would take. There's museums of biblical creation. There's museums in Stone Mountain, Georgia. There's the Faces on the Mountain. There was the Museum of the War of Northern Aggression.
Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure. And so, you know, it's on some level, I wrote this book and I'm thinking about this from the perspective. Of course, I'm also the director of the public history program. So in some ways, like, I'm in the bag. Like, I'm in favor of museums, right? Like, I'm a biased contributor to thinking about this. And a lot of the sort of the thrust of the scholarship has been just outright critical and negative, frankly, towards museums, and from a more perspective inspired by like thinkers like Foucault, that these are all about social control. And I don't know, I think that's, from my perspective, I think that's almost like equally naive in terms of thinking like, oh, people just walk into the museum and then now I'm going to walk into the Museum of Biblical Creation and then I'm going to walk out and be like, oh, well, that's how it happened, you know. We're, like, I think people are also, you know, more sophisticated than that in terms of how they encounter museums. And there's scholars like Tony Bennett in Australia who would disagree with me on that. But I think it's important to see how, first of all, how many museums there are, and just like you say, that they're embracing different perspectives, and certainly at different times, right? I think the Met today is vastly different than the Met in 1969, 1970, as your comment indicates. So, yeah, I think there are lots of different museums, and one of the things that I think about in writing this book is that there are large museums, but there are also small museums that I think about. There are museums on the East Coast, and I also write about museums on the West Coast. So I tried to take a little bit of a balanced perspective, but what this book could include more of is like historic house museums or museums with this strictly conservative bent or ideology. Yeah, that point is well taken. Do one more?
Sure.
Okay, last one, yeah, please.
Very brief. Political persuasion on museums, it can be problematic. I was in New Orleans a long time ago with my wife, who's from Tokyo and whose parents lived through the air raids. And
Interesting.
There was an exhibit at the Museum of the Confederacy,
Yeah.
that war, and it touched my wife. The exhibit touched my wife. She didn't want to leave this particular exhibit. It was, I believe, a flag, stars and bars, and in my family we called it Johnny Grab. Never mind. But messages were sewn into the flag from the wives and daughters of this regiment, and it touched my wife greatly. And I didn't get it. I thought because I grew up raised by a Baltimore guy, and a northerner,
Yeah.
and I didn't get why that was so touching. And she said, "Well, look at the Japanese flags that Americans brought home as war souvenirs,
Yeah.
where the family had written messages. Agree, hate the wars, but the warriors and their families, no matter our political perspectives, I think those items need to be preserved." I later read that item, that very museum, was a lot of controversy when the statues were being torn down,
Yeah.
which I personally supported, but keep the museums. And from Richmond, Virginia, where my sister lived across from Robert E. Lee, we always wanted that statue gone. And I
Yeah.
was from a Southern family. My dad always pointed out that Robert E. Lee was moving south in that statue, and my
Yeah.
mom didn't like that. She was a Southerner. We debated the Civil War in those long station wagon rides. Again,
Right.
no air conditioning. So I believe we should keep all of those exhibits, even the controversial ones.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, just one sort of last story to conclude on is the way the law is structured right now is all about, in terms of Native American objects, it's all about human remains, ancestral remains, and sacred objects, right? Objects that the community has agreed are religiously, spiritually sacred, or significant across cultural patrimony, it's sometimes called, of significance across an entire community. I once had a delegation visiting when I worked at the Field Museum in Chicago, and the delegation, I was going to show them some spoons. So these utensils are sort of the textbook example of a profane object. Like, we don't worship our forks and knives, typically. They're just kind of things that are there. So, but these were spoons that were made by her grandmother. And the last examples of how to make these exact kinds of spoons were destroyed in a house fire of their family. So we open this drawer, and this woman just starts weeping, looking at these spoons. And it just was a real eye-opening example to me of like, oh, what I think of as sacred by the sort of textbook definition of a religious or spiritual artifact might not have the same exact definition to a member of a community. And I can't really make that assumption for one reason or another. So I think that is an interesting example of where we have to reach out to communities, not unlike the award winners tonight, and learn from them about what is important and what's significant and what things should be privileged and preserved for future generations. And the answers might surprise us. Okay, we'll pause there. Thank you.